Hello and welcome to Bright Wings, children's books to make the heart soar. I am your host, Charity Hill. The purpose of this conversation is to help mothers and fathers identify books that will liberate their children to embrace truth, goodness, and beauty. Have you ever wondered, what does a speech-language pathologist do? Is there any connection between speech-language pathology and poetry? What does reading ability have to do with self-regulation? Have you ever considered that education is about formation rather than simply information? Guess which activity at school involves both executive functioning and virtue growth? I'll give you a hint. It's in the language arts category. Joining me to ponder these questions is my fellow logophile, Jenny Richeson. Jenny Richeson joins me to talk about her love for language and words, both their mechanics and their beauty. She is a speech-language pathologist who provides interventions from a holistic cognitive approach. She also loves literature and writes poetry. For this remarkable pairing, she calls herself the speech poet. Jenny now works in private practice in Kentucky after years in low-income public schools. I want to welcome you, Jenny Richeson, the speech poet, to Bright Wings Children's Books. Thanks for being here and having this conversation.
Thank you for having me. Good morning. Good to be with you.
We've both discovered that we have this mutual love for literature and for words, and yours has taken shape differently than mine. But I find that what you're doing is so interesting as a speech-language pathologist and a cognitive interventionist, the way that you want to engage children at a practical level in a way that allows them to live more deeply and more richly.
Yes.
Is that a true understanding?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Tell me about this combination of interests, speech pathology and poetry. You call yourself the speech poet. How did that happen?
During the pandemic, you know how I just got creative with like ways I wanted to grow because I was at home and doing therapy from home and online. And so I got a little bit of coaching from someone who knew what they were doing and decided to put it out there a little bit. Like, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm doing now in private practice. And, and then you've got to get a little bit creative. So I didn't exactly know what to call myself, but I just thought, well, what is it that I do? Or what is it that I've studied? And so it was the speech pathology piece and how I've kind of grown in that field, grown in getting more education in the poetry literature piece. So that's where the speech poet came from. It was unique. I follow a lot of speech pathologists on Instagram. And so it was kind of unique what I was doing. So I thought, that's who I am. And then I guess I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I saw what you were doing. I saw your love for literature and books and trying to get kids and families to read. And reading is just a big passion of mine because so many kids I've encountered over the years don't read well. So many kids in our public schools are not reading on grade level for a lot of reasons. So yeah, we kind of connected, and I felt like from the beginning there was a kindred spirit, and so now here we are talking. So
Jenny, just to spell it out for us, what is a speech language pathologist? What's a cognitive interventionist? So what do I do? What is what are the practical things of your job? And then talk about the things that you love.
Okay.
Right.
So speech pathology, it is a field where I'm trying to provide communication intervention and therapy. For me, it's pediatrics children with a range of communication challenges that look like learning challenges a lot of the time. So it could be in their language, receptive, expressive language, receptive being what they know, and expressive being how well they can express and communicate. Speech, how they talk, how they learn to talk. Talking is typically inherently just learned by hearing, but language is different, right? You can know how to talk, but not know how to spell or write out the language that you're talking. So, and then there's the whole phonological development that comes with language. Once you've you're at an age as a child and you're, let's say you can communicate pretty well, but then you have to learn the mechanics of this letter makes this sound, and you have to understand syllables and units of sound and multi-syllable words. There are many things that can happen that can impair that development. There's a range of disabilities, communication related. There's like apraxia of speech, which is a motor speech disorder. And there are certain speech impairments.
Would a motor speech disorder be, for example, the inability to form the S or the SH or the R sound?
So apraxia, yes, or more severe in that it might look like a 3-syllable word being only able to be produced as a consonant vowel combination, where a child consistently has patterns. Let's say they are always leaving off the last sound, or they're always leaving off syllables. And so their speech can sound, in more severe cases, where they're really unintelligible, it can sound kind of like telegraphic, and they might have the intonation down. So you can hear the rise and fall of the intonation. A lot of times then they know what they're trying to say, but you don't know what it is. It's just very unintelligible. So that's the speech pathology piece as far as language, speech, talking, and the phonological sound system. And then in the last 10 years, I just kind of found my way into the cognition piece. So it's really all connected. It's more of a holistic approach. It's kind of been tricky to figure out how to say what it is I do, because I want to say cognitive intervention, but I'm a speech pathologist more from operating or practicing from that holistic cognitive approach, in that all learning is connected. I mean, the brain is connected, right? So you've got the visual word form area of your brain. You've got the Broca's area, Wernicke's area. You've got these areas of the brain that are responsible for language, communication, speech, learning to understand the printed word language as it's written, orthography. And so I got frustrated. I guess it was both kind of a serendipitous frustration and curiosity, because I just would run into so many kids who weren't learning. And I just wasn't okay with it. I was like, I just feel like there's something we can do. Most kids, I mean, I've never met a child who couldn't learn. It may have been harder for them to learn, but why was this information not going in? What's going on here? I have nieces and nephews in my family, and I've had some of the kids in my family, a couple of them have had some of their own challenges with development when they're younger years. They were 2 of them were adopted from overseas, and so they were lacking in some of the early parental support that they needed, because they lived the first couple years of their life in an orphanage. So it was a combination of just kind of seeing what they needed, how that was pursued, and then the cognition piece really looks at, like visual discrimination, visual processing. It's taking into account everything like auditory processing, which also kind of falls under a speech and language problem. Kids with auditory processing disorders will come to see me. And then there's the executive functioning piece. So that's all the kind of frontal lobe stuff, like self-awareness, self-regulation, being able to have self-control, being able to have some sense of time. Like if you ever seen a child who had no sense of time at all, they can't get their work done. There's usually an executive functioning piece there, where somebody on the outside has to always be their frontal lobe for them. You know what I mean? It's like, you've got a problem on your hands and you need to help that child. So that really kind of explains the cognition piece. Okay. But it's really just looking at the child holistically. That's what it is. This is a holistic child. They cannot be broken down into parts. The way they think and the way they receive information is going to be is reflective of how they're going to learn the subjects they need to learn. So what's going on with the child? And it just takes I'm curious by nature. So sometimes I'll run into a situation with a child and I'm like, I don't know, but I'm going to find out, or I'll read about it, or I'll figure out what can I do to get to the bottom of that and help that child a little bit more. So does that make sense? Does it answer your question? Yeah.
Now, Jenny, there's this other aspect of your personality and your interests, for which you call yourself the speech poet. You love language and words, and you write poetry. Can you tell us about this?
So I really just love language. I love reading. I love writing. I love communication. I love the whole art of language. And to me, it's more of an art. And I did not realize that about myself in my early years in speech pathology in the field. But I also knew that there's a technical clinical side that I can't just live in that place. It's just not rich enough for me.
Yeah.
And so I sort of fell into, I've always loved reading too. I've always loved books, but I didn't know into adulthood that I liked poetry and even had a knack for it. I think the thing that drives me is I see kids that struggle so much to communicate, and I know how gorgeous language can be. And I know it's such a powerful tool that I really want to get them there. It is functional. I'm trying to give them functional communication and help form who they are. But at the same time, I want them to taste a little bit of what they could do if they can really grab hold of communicating well, mastering language well, and being able to read and write well. That is kind of where my heart is in terms of what drives me and why I just love language so much.
Would you say that you love sort of these deeper, more meaningful aspects of language and words in your
Yes.
quote unquote in your kids, and that's what kind of gives you the motivation to help them with mechanical, practical aspects of their therapies?
Yes, absolutely. And just realizing like I genuinely just love children too. I mean, I don't think you could do this because it's a funny comedy of errors sometimes, the things that happen in the therapy room, the things they say or do, especially if there's an executive function piece, if there's a severe ADHD and kids are blurting out ridiculous things. you have to sort of shape that, right? So, and also when I'm able to kind of tell them, listen, I can give you a little bit of power over this awkward social situation you keep finding yourself in at school. Let me tell you what you should say and you should not say if you want to have some friends. And we have those kind of conversations, not all the time, but typically with my middle school kids. You would think some of this is obvious, but it's not obvious for them. Especially, I will see kids come into my therapy room and they are high functioning autistic. And to the outside world, people don't see or know that there's autism there. That's where I can really help them. So yeah, that's that love of language and the love of kids is really what drives me.
I really feel like you are a kindred spirit to me with your love for words and language and all the gear, tackle, and trim that goes along with it. I think one of our shared assumptions, you and me, seems to be that we think the best education is one that acknowledges that the child has a mysterious depth and a profound trajectory from their beginning to their end. And the more we're able to integrate our children, the better. The more we're able to capacitate our children to be well ordered, the better. The more we're able to provide scaffolding, the scaffolding that our child needs for growth and virtue, the better. And the deeper our children engage with meaning, with the great themes of existence, the better. But I also think that we Jenny, that we share an assumption that it's possible to ask, sometimes gently and sometimes very assertively, ask more from our children. How accurate do you think these assumptions are?
Yeah, very accurate. I think very well said. And integration is definitely the key word for me. And in the last, like I said, 10 years that I've studied poetry, studied literature, I've studied classical education. It's given me some of the language to describe what I've seen, maybe sometimes what I've seen lacking in public schools, public education at times, not necessarily in the people and the teachers, because I think teachers are real salt of the earth people, but maybe in the approach to education. I'm just going for integration. And I see a lot of kids who are very disintegrated. And
can you tell me about an example?
Yes.
What does a child with a disintegrated functioning look like?
So in the therapy world, disintegration a common word in the therapy world, but I guess when you talk to a lot of therapists, even like occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech and language therapists, you realize like people outside of our field don't necessarily know what are you talking about. So when I've worked with kids who I would say are disintegrated, it can look like a lot of different things. It could look like severe ADHD in a classroom. It could look like a child who see things that you might describe as it goes in one ear and out the other. They can't process what you said. They can't sit still. They blurt out. They don't have any inhibition, no self-control. They're always hitting or pushing another child in line. Disintegration can look like kids being very sensitive, their sensory systems being very sensitive to, say, really loud noises or certain food textures, so that reportedly you'll hear a parent say they will only eat 1, 2, or 3 things. There, you have to understand what's going on there. And then your goal, again, is integrating more holistic living, really. I've had children before who've had to go to feeding therapy because they weren't eating enough to get nourished. And feeding therapy falls under speech pathology sometimes, and sometimes it's under occupational therapy. It kind of depends.
Interesting.
But I'm not a specialist in the feeding piece. I know a little bit about it. So if I see that as a really big problem, then I'm going to refer out for that. But let's say, go back to the ADHD example. So in a classroom, and the teachers that I've worked with over the years are really great teachers. I don't think you could be at a hard school, like say a lower socioeconomic, where you see a lot of the impact of poverty. I don't think you could stay in a school like that unless you really loved kids. So I've really been around great teachers. But at the same time, a kid like that can drive a teacher crazy, right? And sometimes you want a quick fix. You want them to be put on medicine to control it. And that may be part of the treatment plan, but it's only part of it. There's this whole teaching piece that becomes important with the executive functioning and the self-control. And so you do see that disintegration where, okay, yes, the end goal is learning, but if they can't sit still long enough and control their body long enough to learn, then we're disintegrated there.
Yeah.
We need to look for
Have you had teachers not understand what you're doing with a student in therapy?
Yes, I would say that in a school system, in my experience, they often don't understand the scope of what a speech pathologist can do, perhaps even just a special educator can do. I think a lot of times in my case, they'll think, can you work on their S or their L? Or, they don't have a lot of vocabulary or something like that. You have to constantly educate your teachers and just your clients, your stakeholders, your parents on what you're doing, and continue to educate yourself on how to really be able to help this child and the family. So yes, I have found that sometimes there is a lack of understanding, but at the same time, I felt a pressure probably I put on myself that in a given situation, if I'm on a team and a child, like say they can't read or they can't communicate well, I mean, I'm the specialist. I'm not the regular classroom teacher. So I just didn't like not really being able to help or not knowing, thought, well, that's what my job is. But it's not always an easy thing to figure out in terms of what's going on with the child. So you really have to have holistic assessments as well as holistic therapy.
Jenny, I think we both agree that high grades and test scores are pretty exciting. But these are not the things we're striving for when I quote unquote push high level reading and when you treat dyslexia and executive functioning needs. Funnily enough, I think we both want the same thing for kids, that we want formation for them. We want the deepest things for them. We want to capacitate them to put out into the deep. Can you comment on this? Can you comment about formation? Just a second ago, we were talking about how schools can hardly survive in a certain sense, right? Am I crazy that I want more for my children? Am I crazy that I want them to have formation and not just information? And frankly, not just my kids, everyone's.
So, yeah, I think formation is key. And I think that it's I've seen it attempted, really good efforts in public education settings. Maybe with a different language, it might be more of like a guidance counselor curriculum that will focus on topics of bullying or grit or perseverance, and those are good things. But also, like for instance, at the high school level, I don't really like the phrase college and career ready. And it's not that I am opposed to being ready for your college or career experience. In fact, I think you should be. But I just think it's limiting. I think it's too simplistic. And you and I kind of discussed,
too functional.
Yeah. So it's almost like devaluing who the child really is, because there's actually more to their life than a college and a career. There's virtue, there's being a good human being, there's how you treat other people, how you look at challenges, how you live out what justice is to you. What does justice look like in the way you live it out in your relationships and how you treat people? And so virtue is super important. So if you have good grades, but you're a jerk or you're addicted to video games, and I mean, I don't really like it when kids don't know how to be bored. I'm like, you need to learn how to be bored. You need to find and cultivate your imagination. And that so ties into the cognitive piece, because visualization is huge in cognition, and you have to be able to visualize. We think in pictures. We do not really think in words. The brain has to be able to visualize. I'm a big fan of sanctified imagination. I mean, really pushing imagination and creativity. But technology sort of stunts the brain and doesn't force it to have to visualize, because there's always a screen in front of a developing brain. Yeah.
Or
so
the imagination.
Yeah. Right. And I've thought a lot about this. Some years ago, there's some stuff that C.S. Lewis, I think, has talked about on imagination and cultivating imagination. I think back to myself when I learned how to read, and when I started this journey, really understanding the cognition piece of learning in the last 10 years, I started to remember when I learned how to read. I loved reading, and I could picture, and I can to this day remember picturing in my mind what this character would look like in my mind. I was generating an image without knowing I was doing it, right? Because I was giving myself over to the book, to the story, to the text, and allowing myself to be lost in it. I mean, I've seen so many children, young children, literally addicted to a screen that they just had a fit when you took it away from them. They couldn't do any learning except for on a computer.
Yikes, right? Virtues and vices are, characterized by being stable habits, and they habituate us, right? That's why the concern of education being about formation rather than information is so important. That child has been habituated to a technological way of being rather than a human way of being.
There's a problem there. They're really undercutting what they could do with their mind, but they have to be taught well. They have to be coached appropriately. They don't know how much time they need to be on technology. The grown-ups in their lives need to monitor that. Yeah, that whole college and career ready, it's just not, I just think the whole phrase should be leveled up a little bit. College, career, and virtue ready. You know what I mean? Or like,
yeah, I'm trying to think of a good phrase.
Right.
A good substitute phrase for college and career ready. Like
college, career, and good guy ready. Like
humanity formed.
Yes, right. Yes.
Forming humanities.
Exactly. So if I could add to that a little bit, Charity, I'll say, please. So in my private practice, I have really had to do a little bit more personal formation at times in therapy. And I'll talk to the parents about it. I'm always very open with parents about kind of what I see and what I want to work on, in order to eliminate some behaviors that are not desirable, like a child who maybe going to hide and duck under a table or a chair and just, no, I don't want to do this with you right now, or whatever. I will sit down with them. We just kind of back up to the beginning of, let's just get the rules of engagement set. Sometimes we do I am statements, like I am respectful, I am confident, I am okay with not knowing something. I see a lot of kids that can't handle getting things wrong. Even though they have lots of learning challenges, they really can't handle sometimes when they're wrong. there's a lot of formation that comes with what does it look like when you fail at a task and how that's not being a failure. And there's a real difference in how you view yourself. Sometimes kids come in with a lot of shame and rejection because they maybe have been teased by something, or they know that they don't quite measure up in an academic way or a social skills kind of way, or they don't have as many friends as they want. And so formation sort of looks like affirming who they are, but also having high expectations for how they're going to treat me. We're not going to duck under tables anymore. We're not going to do that. Okay, you need to sit down. Stuff like that.
You must have, oh my gosh. I'm just so glad there are people like you in the world, because I'm just confronted with my own limitations, and I like just keeping your calm through all of that. Having such a grip on the good too, Jenny. I don't know how, I mean, you must have just such a firm grasp of the good and so much hope for these kids that they can grow, that they can sit in the chair instead of hide under the chair. Because otherwise, how would you engage in therapy if you didn't have this grip on the good and this firm hope for these kids?
You know,
if a kid did that to me, I'd be like, okay, I quit. It's over. I can't handle this.
Right. You know, I know I've got to give credit here where credit's due. I have worked with so many good people in the public school arena that were so good at handling really difficult behaviors. I have seen such extreme behaviors. Okay. I have been smacked by kids. I have had my glasses ripped off my face, thrown in the garbage can. I've been kicked in the stomach. I've had jewelry pulled off my neck. I mean, and this is over the course of a lot of years. You know, it's not fun, and you definitely need to get away quick. Like, don't get yourself in a position where you can get kicked in the stomach. But if you're talking about kids with not only, some of these kids have learning challenges, right? They don't necessarily have if I worked with you in the public schools, you had an IEP. But the ones I see privately, they don't all have an IEP. But some of these kids have more severe disabilities, right? And sometimes those kind of behaviors come with that. But if you're with a good team of people who are really good with those kinds of things, you just learn a lot. And you just learn to love them, but you have high expectations. And that means pretty clearly saying what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. And my husband is really great at this. If I have a challenge sometimes in the therapy room, and I'll come home and talk to him and say, because he deals with discipline. So he deals with a lot of this. One of his things that he does in his role, he's not necessarily like the top instructional guy. He does a lot of things, but he's really good with discipline. He's got a reputation of being firm but fair. And he has kids in his office that cry a lot. I mean, that's just education for you. If you're going to get in trouble and you're in the principal's office, you're probably going to end up crying at some point. You know,
crying is actually good. Like crying,
yeah,
is a good sign.
Like,
crying's
right.
Good. You don't want defiance. You don't want people lying. Like, no, I didn't do it. There were 5 witnesses, but definitely I did not do it.
Exactly. Right.
You know, you want tears probably. So that's great. Your husband makes kids cry. I mean, like in a beautiful way.
In a beautiful way. Right. Right. And it's such an opportunity. It's an opportunity for character formation.
Yeah.
It's just such good groundwork for good, hard conversations that are necessary.
Yeah. I just think you must have both hands like really gripped into goodness, like that you can have high standard, like that you can have high expectations. What do you think? What kind of effect do you think your high expectations have on your kids, on your therapy kids?
Great question. I think they really love it. I think in the end, kids want boundaries. If they know that you love them and that relationship is strong, and there is plenty of opportunities in the therapy room where we laugh a lot. There's plenty of opportunity for that. But if they cannot do the basics of respect and good behavior, we will not have any laughter. Okay. With correct behavior comes some freedoms. And so I think they really want that. And they almost light up. They sit up a little straighter, like, she really believes in me. She's really holding me to a high expectation. I had to,
do Do your high expectations actually give them new possibilities for themselves?
Yes. I mean, I've got a child right now, a middle schooler, and this child's parent has said, my child is completely transformed in the last year that he's been working with you. He had really had some significant challenges, behavior-wise going on. And now there's a little bit of a benefit. One-on-one comes with some perks, right? I've done lots of classroom teaching before when the group is bigger, but you have some privileges in a one-on-one situation that are different. And so a lot of kids, they thrive under that and they need that. And so, just this week I had to really correct someone and say, you can't do that. You're 15 now. In 5 years, you're 20. And if you do that on a job, you will very likely get fired. Okay, that's the reality. And then at the end of his mother was around, and we were like, "Are you mad at Miss Jenny? Are you sad? Are you upset?" He was like, "No, I'm fine. I'm fine." He was fine with it, but the relationship is strong. And I wouldn't have gone in on day one and said, "Here's the law of the land, buddy." I wouldn't do that because that just wouldn't work.
Right. You have to build a relationship.
Absolutely. They'd be like, "Peace out, Miss Jenny. I don't want to be your friend." They wouldn't want to come back, Yeah. And so we work over time at building the relationship. And then I can raise the expectation as we go along and come in with a strong expectation, but also ask for more at times.
Yes. Jenny, you work with a lot of children who have barriers to what I would call deep reading, perhaps. One of the things that I'm always doing on Bright Wings is I'm always asking us to try to attend to things that are meaningful, try to identify books that are worth reading. And I do this not because I'm an elitist. I'm after all, I'm an American. We're not elitist. We're democratic. I'm from a small town and we hate elitism. But I think it's just that my superpower is that I always want to live deeply. I always want to live with a deep awareness of meaning. I want to connect my children to meaningful ideas and meaningful living. Sometimes that means, really meaningful books. Sometimes that means spending a lot of time outside. But yeah, books for the sake of meaningful living, books for the sake of the joy of living.
Yes, I love that about your purpose. And I think that's what really attracted me to what you were trying to do, because it's something I would sort of like to do, but I don't quite have the time. So I'm like, oh, I'm glad you're doing it.
Thanks.
Like somebody do this. And the reason I say that is because I feel so strongly about reading. And I feel like I've really kind of come to understand the nuance and the complexity of reading and kind of what it looks like in our country to some degree, which is this. There's a lot of kids in classrooms, I think, across our country they're just not reading well, or they're not reading on grade level. And there's a lot of controversy over how to teach reading, which I don't really understand why it's still there, because if you sort of follow the science on it, it's pretty clear that the best way to teach it is from this phonological sound system. You have to teach the kid how to decode. They have to understand the sound system, right? And they have to have the tools to do it. It's not whole language. You don't teach kids to read by saying, look at the picture and let the picture help you read. The picture can help you understand the meaning of the story, but not the art of decoding, right?
There's not a lot of controversy about the science, you said.
Right. But these can be very heated things in school systems. And I think there's plenty of studies that say poverty leads to a lack of reading, only because of you're trying to survive. There's other issues at stake. And so I think what you have in a lot of classrooms is this. You have a couple levels. You've got kids who don't know how to read because they're not really being taught the right way. And teacher preparation programs aren't really teaching teachers how to teach reading. Okay, so the teachers have to be prepared appropriately. And a lot of those classes at the college level aren't doing that per se. I don't know why, but they're not, based on a lot of my own research that I've done. But then you've also got your kids in classrooms that even if they were taught that sound system, they're still probably going to have a reading disability. You've got that too. So which is it, right? There's kids that probably really have a reading disability, but then there's kids that just aren't being taught in the right way. So I think there's something like 1%. I listened to a series of podcasts last summer on reading in America. Lots of stats, numbers, science behind it. Don't quote me on this, but it was something like only 1% of the people will, for some more severe disability or reason, not be able to read. So if you think about that, maybe half the kids in a given classroom are below grade level. So why is that? I really think this is, like I say, read to be free. You read for pleasure, but you read to be free, right? So this is what our country is founded on, to think deeply, to understand how to think, to understand logic, to engage in conversation. You have to be able to read well. My husband will say that anytime he has a child that comes to him and there's a behavior issue, he always checks grades first. Always the child doesn't read well at all. Very much below grade level, like high schooler, 5th grade or below grade reading level. And that's when you see a lot of behaviors. And jail numbers are directly tied to illiteracy.
Oh my gosh.
So it is a problem. It's a problem.
What a mysterious thing. I mean, is it too complicated of a question to ponder? What does reading well have to do with self-regulation then?
So much.
Right? I mean, we're talking about if we read to be free, and if reading deeply has something to do with like a self-governing people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then to like break it down to the microcosm of one human person governing oneself from within, what is my relationship with others? Like you said something earlier about justice. Do I live with justice? Do I treat others with justice? What does self-regulation have to do with reading ability? I mean, what an interesting thing you've brought up.
Right. Well, and not only that, one thing I've really learned in the past year with my own education and what I'm trying to do is that there's so much more self-regulation required when it comes to writing. It's a huge tax on your executive function system. And so to be able to do it, absolutely. So to
writing
be able to write well,
huge task of your executive functioning system.
Because you have to slow your thinking down enough you have to plan, formulate, you have to know how to spell, you have to know grammar and punctuation. You have to slow things down so much, and you have to control your body so much to sit and write. I have so many kids, and I see this a lot in middle schools when it really starts bothering me. I'm like, oh, not good. I do a lot of writing instruction, increasingly more writing instruction since COVID. Kids will say, I don't want to write. I don't like to write. We don't write at school anymore. All we do is type. I'm like, well, we have a problem then. You need to know how to write. So it is hard to get kids to write, and even have had situations where I was going over a 5th grader's essay on something, and this child had some mistakes. And I said, well, what's going on there? And she goes, oh, I don't know. It's just text predict. It just predicted what I wanted to say. So I just left it alone. And I was like, oh no.
Oh no.
Real low self-awareness on, like, if the computer just did it for me. So in her mind, that means I don't have to think. It did it for me. And it wasn't right. So writing is a huge thing. So not reading executive function skills, yes, but writing even more so. And I don't know what it is at least with the population I see, by and large, they don't want to write, and they need to write.
No, it's true. Writing hurts. It really does.
Yeah.
It hurts. Yeah. And it involves so much thinking, and thinking is one of the hardest things for us to do now. Organizing and handwriting and spelling, those are all different parts of the brain. Thinking is hard, but it's only one of the reasons why writing is so hard.
Do you see that with your own kids?
Yes. And the child with the lower executive functioning finds writing harder than their sibling. And so writing is pretty tasking for this child, just area of growth.
The payoffs are huge, though. It's like I wish I could just get a child to see, like, if you do this, though, if you sow this seed, you do this.
Yeah.
I mean, just what it's going to develop in them. But it's hard to get kids to get excited about future long-term growth for what they do right now.
Yes.
It's hard.
Yes.
Yeah.
I realized though that even though that I love the, great works of literature, and that's kind of my job, is to repropose living deeply. There are other mothers and fathers that have to ask a totally different set of questions. Mm-hmm. And that's okay too. For example, there's this really sweet friend of mine who, she and her husband both love classical education and books and writing and language. And they want this for their children. But of their 4 children that they've been given, 2.5 of them have dyslexia. One didn't quite, was like 3 points from being, rated as dyslexic. So that's why she says 2.5 of them are dyslexic. And one may have ADHD, and she's asking a whole different set of questions than me. And she's engaging in a whole different set of tasks than me. She's an amazing mother. So she still wants these beautiful things for her children, but she has to go about things way differently than me. Right. So this summer, the whole family listened to a book that each child is going to be reading in the coming year, and then they talk it over. So they listen to it as an audiobook and as a family, and then they talk it over. And she doesn't insist that they read challenging books at home, because at school they're being asked to read above grade level books, pretty often.
I really love when parents have high expectations like that. I think it's wonderful. It is something else to consider when you've got some struggling learners in your own family. And there's an emotional side to that. So the first thing I would say is every family needs the right people on their team. So that's when you probably really need to spend some time seeking out the right professionals, educate yourself as much as you can. And you don't necessarily lower your expectations, but you do tweak them maybe, depending on where your child is at the time, right? Also, what I have seen is there is an emotional piece. Sometimes there's a grief that comes with, oh, this is something my kid has, and they might have to deal with it for a while. And I've seen parents say, can you wrap this up and fix this in 6 months? I mean, all parents want that kind of result sometimes. And there's just really no way to say, yes, I can do that in 6 months. And so I think you kind of have to get the long game, kind of engage that question with kindness and curiosity about yourself. Like, there's something that triggers me in a deeper level of frustration with this child that I have that struggles, or makes me feel inadequate because I don't know what to do. It's just a question worth asking, because I think it will lead to more growth. But by all means, you just have to get the right professional. Every speech pathologist isn't necessarily going to know a ton about reading or dyslexia. I think we have our specialties, right? It's a big field. So yeah, you wouldn't want to find someone who's just, I do feeding therapy, right? You've got to find who can really speak to that in your family, with your child. And also on that, if I may add, I would be so interested if your listeners would be so kind to do this. I'm at a point with what I'm doing where I'm curious what parents need. I'm curious what teachers need. I'd love input from people on, this is what I'm dealing with at home. I'm looking at ways that I can grow and support families and kids and teachers and just my communities.
Can they reach out to you through Instagram?
Yes. Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
You are at Speech Poet?
At the Speech Poet. Yeah.
The Speech Poet. At the Speech Poet.
Yeah.
Okay. That's your Instagram
Jenny
handle.
Richeson.
Jenny Richeson.
Yeah.
So that would be great to hear from parents and teachers what it is that they need.
Right. Absolutely. And their experiences. And I mean, it was just a few years ago that I got out of public education and to do private work full time. However, I do realize things are quite a bit different because of COVID, even since then. I know the things have changed. So I'd say there's probably different questions and issues on the table that I'd love to hear about from people.
Well, Jenny, I want to tell you a story that I think sums up our conversation. When I was in 5th grade, I was actually I was actually assigned to do speech therapy. My parents and teachers, I think, had thought that I was going to grow out of an R problem that I had. Mm-hmm. So I said my R's almost like I was from Boston. So it's so funny because I love language and I love words and I love accents. But my R problem was an ah problem. So I would say my name Charity instead of Charity. People thought my name was Trudy sometimes. I've even heard people misunderstand my name as Judy or Cherokee. Very humbling. So even my own name was a little tricky for me. But when I was when I was told that I had to go to speech therapy in 5th grade, I was so humiliated. And I was so humiliated. I thought I was going to die. I remember like shouting and crying at my parents in the kitchen because when my siblings had some speech therapy, but they were littler than me when they'd gone through the program. I remember telling them that I was not going to go. I was going to be one of those kids hiding under the desk, Jenny. As a 10-year-old, 11-year-old. But I came to this realization where I realized the best way to get through this is to work really hard and get out of this program as fast as possible. And so I did work really hard to master the sound and get out of the program. I remember reading aloud very silly R poems and tongue twisters alone, going through this packet of material and pushing myself and listening to my sound and correcting my sound. And gradually becoming secretly proud of my work and improvement. Although I didn't want anybody to even acknowledge that I was working hard because I didn't want anybody to even acknowledge that I was in therapy. And I remember all that clearly. So this all came up because lately I was going through my baby book, like materials that my mom had tucked into my baby book from growing up, report cards and awards. And I discovered my IEP papers. And I also found that 3 months after graduating from the speech program, a letter to my parents asking my parents to let me be admitted to the school's gifted program. What's crazy is I wouldn't have ever remembered belonging to the school's gifted program because it was boring. It was so boring. But I really remember going through this speech therapy experience and that being really formational, not just for the formation of my sound, my R sound, but it was really shaped my character. I think back, I guess I was reflecting on all this and two things came up. One is that what you're doing has so much to do with character, right? Human formation, not just a mechanical formation of the way that I make my sound. Two things came up. So one is I wasn't in speech therapy because I was stupid, right? Of course that's true, but really finding both sets of papers, my speech therapy papers, and then this gifted program letter, like all these things can actually coincide in one human life, right?
Absolutely.
And then the second thing that I realized in finding these papers and reflecting on this experience is that speech therapy played a far more pivotal role in my life than being in the gifted program did. If it weren't for that piece of paper in the baby book, I never would have remembered that I was in the gifted program. We all want our children in the gifted program. We don't want them in therapy. But what's far more important is what happened to me in the speech therapy, right? I marvel at how important that therapy has been for me. Would I have gone to Canada and given retreats to hundreds of young people? Would I have been in Ireland speaking to large groups of Irish young people? Would I be facilitating well-read mom groups? Would I be doing things at my church? Would I have this podcast if I still introduced myself as Charity? Maybe I wouldn't have had the confidence. And fixing the mechanical problem really helped me to grow in a human way.
I love that. I love that story. And it would be so cool if more people would come out and say, hey, this was my experience when I was younger, maybe going to speech therapy or I don't know, even occupational therapy because I couldn't hold my pencil. There's just so much stuff that I think as a therapist on this end, this is what you hope for, right? I see all that the child could be. Like there's a lot that this kid could be. There's unlimited potential, like in all of us. But sometimes it's those struggles that get you to where You need to be more than what you're naturally gifted at or what's easiest, right? So
Just staying
the fact that
in the place
you kind of are, yeah, like you're a good communicator. I mean, I would encourage, well, probably your listeners, they know what your website and blog looks like, but if you don't, check it out because it's cool. But you do all this stuff with communication and books, and it's just, I love it. And and our therapy is hard. Ours is hard.
Is it?
Oh, sometimes when kids come I'm like, listen, I had this little talk with my friends. I say, listen, if R was a person, I'd sit him down and say, we're going to have a talk because you're too difficult for anybody. R is so hard for some kids. And I say, it is a hard sound. Takes a while. It's just like, it's not like a B or a D or an M or a P, these early developing. And kids are like, oh, I can't say my R. And there's a kid everywhere in a school that can't. It takes time. It takes practice. It's just as valuable to work on that as it is to address, I don't read very well, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're two different things, but they're super important, especially to self-image and growth. And so anyway, I love that you share that story. That's a good story. And that speech therapy was more valuable to you than being in the gifted program.
Yes.
Score
one.
Right.
Oh my gosh. You're the salt of the earth, Jenny. What you're doing is life-saving. I mean, it's really life-saving.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
I would love it if you'd conclude by reading one of your poems.
Okay. So when I was studying poetry, right, I was working in the school. So a lot of my material was what I did every day, homework assignments. So this is kind of from that time. It's called South Heights Students Celebrate Back to School with Rock the Block Party. It's all hands on deck, all adults on call for all kids at all times. Moved indoors because of rain threat, steam bath August heat, 50-cent Coke and hot dogs and galaxy painted cafeteria, stars and planets as backdrop, coloring contests for prizes. Also inflatable full gym, kids jumping in bright red bounce house, speeding down slide, mouths open in unleashed laughter, shoes strewn, stench of feet and sweat, packed with people, assistant principal as DJ, manning microphone and music. Then face painting, cheek as canvas layered on glistening skin. Rocket, flower, butterfly, Superman. Teachers in classrooms, welcome smiles for families to witness where their child lives, learns for 180 days of the year. Same day, white van swerved onto Barcelona's pedestrian promenade. Another mass murder, few days after Charlottesville. So I paint faces with the best, splendor in surrounding ruins. These small designs holding on to you, culture, tight squeeze around kids because the world we have to give is on fire. This purple butterfly wing, this blue rocket, my prayer. Learn to love yourself, family, friends, our split America. Don't get lost, dear student. In exchange for reading and math, hugs and smiles, parties to celebrate holidays, great behavior. Be better than this. Promise you won't forget the face paint, the pink crown I adorned you with, how I dressed you up, helped you believe you are that cocooned treasure, that point guard, that flower, that Superman.
Thank you.
Are you crying? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for letting me read that. I appreciate it. This has been fun. We should do it again. Come to Kentucky.
I would love to. I want to meet our neighbor, Wendell Berry, and you.
He's on my bucket list.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Jenny. What a delight. With a grateful heart, I dedicate today's podcast to Ruth Davison, my 5th grade speech therapist.